Brazil has called for the BRICS nations to create a common currency for trade and investment between each other so as to reduce their vulnerability to dollar exchange rate fluctuations. The proposal was made at the BRICS Summit in Johannesburg. In fact, yesterday, Brazil's president said that nations that don't use dollars should be not forced to trade in the currency. Remember, de-dollarization has been gaining momentum for a while now, with India making strides in pushing for its own currency and succeeding at it. We'll discuss India's bids there, but also BRICS currency is an interesting proposal, one with its own set of political, fiscal, geographical challenges. Is it possible to have a common BRICS currency? We'll find out. Kartik joining us here in the newsroom. Kartik, interesting. BRICS saying we want a common currency, but not all nations will agree. BRICS plus Ethiopia, not all of them will agree because they have their own separate set of challenges. But run us through what the proposal is to begin with.
So, Shweta, I think, this came up because there were announcements both in Russia and China and some quarters in those two countries suggesting that on the agenda in Johannesburg, South Africa, is a common currency, or a framework at least for a common currency between the BRICS nations. Remember, the BRICS nations originally being Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So a common currency between these 5 nations. Some quarters reported that this is a common BRICS currency is going to be on agenda, but India had summarily dismissed that idea. In fact, Foreign Secretary Vinay Quatra, as well as last month Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar, External Affairs Minister, had said that there is no question of, leave alone an agenda, there is no question of a common currency framework within this bloc. And you're right. I mean, having a common currency or dethroning the dollar, of course, is a far cry. It's not easy, and neither would I suspect is it a recommended option that you have a common currency. And look at the mix of BRICS. Let's just look at the original mix of BRICS and come to the new members subsequently. You've got Russia. Russia is under Western sanctions. The Russian ruble is pretty much a piece of paper if you want to trade anywhere in the West, like is the dollar in Russia. You don't really have any value of the dollar because you cannot transact in dollar. In fact, Russia is not even part of the SWIFT code anymore. So you can't even, it's taken the SWIFT as a mechanism which communicates between banks for transferring exchange of transactions of money across denominations, across currencies, has discarded Russia from the SWIFT payment mechanism. So that is challenge number 1. What is the value of the Russian ruble today, and does it make sense for India to follow the same value? Or vice versa, what is the value of the Indian rupee today against the dollar, and does it make sense for Russia to have the same value or a common currency therein? Look at the problems that China is facing. China's currency has been devalued, trade in China is down, unemployment is high, inflation is low. Currency has a very direct impact on all these geopolitical as well as macroeconomic issues. Now, if there is inflation in India and there is deflation in China, and imagine the two countries having the same currency, what do? Do you tighten or do you loosen?
Interesting.
Right. Now, compare this with, let's say, the Eurozone. Europe has a common currency called the euro, and that euro, because of the geographical alignment, because of a close proximity between these nations, trade of Europe versus rest of the world using the same channels, input, output, going through the same little continent of Europe, it is far easier for a Europe to have a common currency. But we've seen what has happened even with Brexit, for example. The pound was never part of euro. The Swiss franc was never part of the euro. So there are individual nations, individual states which have their own place politically, geopolitically, geographically, and from an economic trade standpoint. So it's next to impossible to expect that countries as diverse as India, China, Russia, leave alone Brazil for now, leave alone South Africa for now, even Russia, China and India, to have a common currency, and that currency allowing members of these 3 diverse countries to transact with the rest of the world at the same equal level playing field is next to impossible. Now, of course, we had put this discussion, this conversation to bed when we got the statement of our Foreign Secretary Vinay Quatra that there is no agenda on a common currency. And economists the worldwide had also shunned this idea that, it can't really happen. Until yesterday when Vladimir Putin decides to, in his video address at the BRICS Summit, decide to rake up this issue again. Now, he's coming from a very different school of thought. It obviously makes sense for Russia to have an alternative to the dollar. It makes sense perhaps to some limit for China to have an alternative to the US dollar. Remember, China had also decoupled its currency. It wasn't a free float. China had enough and more levers available in its own monetary framework to be able to de-link the movements of the yuan with the dollar. So it has in the past operated with some degree of flexibility and some degree of capital control to not let the movements of the dollar or the demand supply of the dollar impact its own currency. That's not the case with India. India is asking countries and companies the worldwide to come invest in India, right? That trade is still denominated by the dollar. India itself has been trying to settle trade bills with Russia in the Indian rupee. That hasn't happened. So you're trying to circumvent the dollar because it will otherwise come into Western sanctions. But the point is, I think the agenda at BRICS should have been, if perhaps it still might be, to push for trade settlement in local currencies as opposed to trade settlement across countries using the US dollar and not really push for a common currency, because it's virtually impossible in the times that we live in and the different geopolitical tensions and economic imbalances in this entire bloc, leave alone the rest of the world or the expanded bloc with the addition of 6 new members including Egypt and Ethiopia, Argentina, etc. It's going to be next to impossible for a common currency to exist in this bloc.
I suppose the entire conversation, the idea of the conversation revolved around having trade settlements in their
local currencies.
own local
Absolutely.
currencies, and hence the idea of a common currency was floated. But you're right, given the differences, the geographical differences, not just political differences, if we were to set that aside for once, the geographical differences also make it next to impossible to have a currency which can be traded between all of these countries, but perhaps on the idea of de-dollarization, and we've been discussing that here on Newsline. I'm hoping that you can weigh in on that. India's been pushing for de-dollarization. Russia, of course, has an agenda because its ruble does not hold any value if it's to be exchanged in dollar. Can't happen anymore. So the idea on an individual level, do you see India has met with some success there? Because we've done so with Bangladesh. We've sort of we've settled, and in the latest we've also settled trade with the UAE. So that perhaps is a fresh move, and India is succeeding at that.
I mean, see, Shweta, it's all very jingoistic and nationalistic to believe that, hey, we have the power to dethrone the dollar, or we want the dollar dominance to end. It's far from, reality. Far from reality and far from any sort of success in terms of fruition of that dream as well. So, number one, does it make sense to even have a lofty dream like that? What happens tomorrow if you have a balance of payment crisis like you had in the early 1990s? It led to liberalization, but it actually also led to whatever gold reserves, physical gold reserves that India's central bank, the RBI, had to be physically shipped to the Bank of England. Right? That is the kind of hedging India had to do to seek a loan from IMF. Or World Bank if I'm not mistaken, right? So you needed that sort of hedging to be done for your gold to be physically lifted and taken to another central bank for you to get a little loan. Now what happens if you have a balance of payment crisis again? You de-link yourself with the dollar completely. The forex reserves of the US dollar to the tune of about $600 billion that the RBI has right now is going to be will work in the terms of, let's say, Shaktikanta Das himself. What he mentioned yesterday is that it's an umbrella. You are free to open that umbrella when it begins to rain, when it begins to pour. You have that cover of a dominant world currency called the US dollar to cover for any exigency where you want to create or you want to contain any volatility in your own currency. You can sell or you can buy the US dollar using Indian rupees. The second problem with the Indian rupee is that unlike China and of course unlike the US dollar itself, we don't have a complete capital control over the Indian rupee. For example, if you were to travel to the UK, you can't pay 2,000 rupees in cash to get 20 pounds. You've got to first convert the 2,000 rupees cash to the US dollar and then convert the US dollar to an equivalent amount in pounds, right? And that is the case across the world. Euro, any other currency that you want to buy apart from the US dollar, you don't have complete capital control to convert the Indian rupee into any other currency. Now, coming back to the central currency idea and the fact that, is there merit in exploring a common currency for the BRICS, which I think is honestly an absurd idea, simply because where is the central bank going to be placed? Are we happy to be part of a central BRICS currency with the central bank controlling that currency
outside of India,
in Beijing, right? Or in St. Petersburg, or in Moscow, or in Johannesburg? I don't think so.
It doesn't seem feasible.
I don't think so. Would they be happy with the central bank residing in India? Not at all. So the
So
whole idea
beyond
of a common
bilateral
currency,
trade, the idea of a common currency does not merit a discussion.
not in a disparate group like the BRICS, and it gets even more
So
disparate
the
with the
idea of
invitation.
therefore dethrowing dollar, is there some merit to the idea, or is it just in the realm of, oh, okay, let's be, chest thumping jingoists and let's try and dethrone
See,
dollar? Can we dethrone dollar?
There is merit in trade settlement in local currency simply because if you were to settle trade using the Indian rupee, there is greater demand to buy Indian rupees from the rest of the world. The rest of the world will, if the rest of the world is willing to pay India in the Indian rupee, then it is buying Indian rupees. And if it is buying Indian rupees, the value of the Indian rupee goes high, just like the stock markets. You buy a stock, you buy a currency, the value goes up. Now, if the value goes up, that value pegged against the dollar, you get to buy more US dollars in lesser amount of Indian rupees. So, overall, the concept is great in theory, right? It will be wonderful to have more rupee transactions, rupee denominated transactions with the rest of the world. But dethroning the dollar, even in my lifetime, if I can take that, stick my neck out and say, seems
Not
like
happening.
a very, very distant dream.
Far-fetched,
Yeah, totally
distant.
far-fetched.
Is there even a need for a common currency beyond dollar? Is the
I
question.
think Russia wants the
But
US
Russia has
dollar's
a vested
hegemony to
interest.
end, right?
Absolutely.
Given what Russia is facing right now, the sanctions, right? It still has to trade with
So
the
the
world.
non-Western allies, of course, want an alternative to the dollar, but it's not happening for other Western institutions. Also, as far as global lending institutions is concerned, as far as they continue to lend in dollars, I don't see dollar being dethroned at any point of time.
Absolutely. See, it's dollar denominated. So, at some point you could possibly cash in those dollars and convert them into the local
Right,
currency.
but you've got
the
to
calculation is
buy
based on
dollars.
dollar terms, right?
Right.
So they are lending dollars to your central bank, which then converts that into rupee for disbursement
Right.
or for utilization across the country. But I think coming back to your root question, Russia has got a vested interest. Now, it's also a function of how much trade is there within this bloc. Euro was a very different example because you had interlinkages between Russia,
And
between
free-flowing
France, between
trade,
Spain. There was
yes.
free-flowing trade because of road connectivity, railway connectivity, movement of goods, services, passengers, citizens. That movement was there. So you could take a bus ride from one country to another and use the same currency.
Absolutely.
Now, with the trade between these blocks also not at par with, let's say, China continues to be the central trade partner for India, for Russia, for South Africa, for Brazil. But outside of China, there's hardly any trade between the remaining four countries.
Right.
And now add 6 more to that block and increase the confusion for the currency.
And it's a whole lot of confusion. So the idea of BRICS currency there, of course, looks very far-fetched. But remember, a proposal was put in at the BRICS Summit in Joburg, which is currently on, where Brazil president, batted for the idea of a common currency. We don't know whether that's going to happen or not. Still very initial phase.